On the 25th of March 1807, one of the most momentous pieces of legislation in the history of the British Parliament became law.
From the first day of May, the African slave trade and all manner of dealing and trading in slaves shall be utterly abolished, prohibited, and declared to be unlawful.
The Act for the Abolition of the Slave Trade brought to an end the practice of capturing slaves and taking them off to work in the colonies. It was a great victory for those who believed slavery was a terrible, barbaric practice.
And a crushing defeat for the slave traders and plantation owners who'd benefited so much from slavery.
But why did Britain really get rid of the slave trade?
It's a question of interpretation. This house in Hull was the birthplace of William Wilberforce, seen by many as the main man in the struggle to end slavery.
The slave trade, founded in wickedness, must be abolished. However we achieve it, whatever the consequences, I am from this time determined never to rest until I have effected its abolition.
The house is now a museum, telling the story of Wilberforce and the anti-slavery campaign. There are exhibits following Wilberforce through his childhood, his election as a local MP, and the years of campaigning that followed. Wilberforce's interest was sparked after he met a missionary, the Reverend James Ramsay, who had worked on a slave plantation in the West Indies.
The West Indies supplied Britain with luxuries like sugar and cotton, a trade which made many of the plantation owners very rich. But as Ramsay pointed out, the process relied on a brutal system of slavery.
A sheep, a horse, or a cow is much better protected by the law than a poor slave.
Slaves were frequently beaten, sometimes to death. In the eyes of their owners, the slaves were just tools, items to be thrown away if they didn't work properly. As this poster shows, they were bought and sold like goods in a shop. It seems incredible now, but in 1787, when Wilberforce first raised the issue of abolishing the slave trade, he faced stiff opposition. This cartoon, published by the trade supporters, even dares to suggest the slaves had a good time, and that, in saying otherwise, Wilberforce was actually deceiving the British public. The Wilberforce Museum records his struggle against this kind of ignorance. It preserves his letters to MPs, the petitions he organised, the speeches he made, all evidence of a 20-year struggle to overturn public opinion.
Not surprisingly, at the opening of the museum in 1906, the speeches emphasise his central role in the anti-slavery story.
I think Wilberforce is seen as kind of being a kind of civic icon. He is seen as being one of the things that gives Hull an identity as being the birthplace of a great humanitarian and philanthropist. So it's one of the things that people are very proud of in Hull.
But is the interpretation of history presented by this museum correct? Were the efforts of Wilberforce and his colleagues the main reason slavery was abolished? Professor James Walvin, an expert on the history of the slave trade, has his doubts.
Clearly, it would not have happened as and when it did without Wilberforce. I mean, he was the great guiding inspiration, he was the great leader in Parliament, no one denies that. But whether that's a kind of sufficient and complete explanation, that's the kind of things that historians are now very dubious about.
Instead, modern historians have focused on a much less honourable reason for the abolition of slavery. While Wilberforce was trying to convince people slavery was inhuman, others were changing the way people thought about trade and finance. At the forefront of these new ideas was Adam Smith, the famous economist. He argued that forcing people to work was a bad idea.
Work done by slaves, though it appears to cost only their maintenance, is in fact the dearest of any.
His point was that freed people were happier, worked harder, and spent their wages, which helped the economy as a whole. He thought that was much more important than providing cheap labour for a few plantation owners.
This is the politician Lord Palmerston, writing 40 years later.
Don't imagine that the laws for the suppression of the slave trade were valuable only for ridding mankind of a foul and detestable practice. The fact is, with the vast population of Africa left free to participate in peaceful trade, there was a great commercial benefit. The anti-slavery laws were indirectly laws for the encouragement of commerce.
So, the reason the slave trade started?
Money.
And the reason it ended?
Money. But there's more to it than that.
The other thing, of course, that is always left out of the agenda of British museums is the question of the slaves. What role do they play in bringing about their own freedom? And in all of this, their noise is off stage. They're 5,000 miles away. People have forgotten about them. And yet the slaves influence the outcome just as surely as Wilberforce himself.
Slave rebellions were common, and many of the plantations were in a state of near war. All that drove up the cost of producing crops on the plantations, making slavery less worthwhile. Slave rebellions had another effect too. Reports of slaves standing up to their owners reminded people that slaves were human beings.
Public opinion against slavery grew. And it wasn't just slaves on the plantations who made their mark. Freed slaves, like Olaudah Equiano, campaigned tirelessly for the end of the slave trade. Arguably, they had just as much influence as Wilberforce did.
It all adds up to a different interpretation of the anti-slavery story. Not surprisingly then, the Wilberforce Museum's due for a revamp.
Wilberforce House is a good old-fashioned kind of interpretation of Wilberforce and his role, but that's not to say that there aren't other ways of looking at it.
The slavery and Wilberforce displays here were done in 1983, so they're now almost 20 years old. And aside from starting to look a bit dated, since then a lot of research has been done on the history of slavery, and a lot of interpretations of it have changed. So we'd maybe like to kind of incorporate a lot of the new thinking into the interpretations of the new displays we'd like to do.
So why did Britain get rid of the slave trade? It's a question of interpretation.